Ferrat's Edge was not a beautiful planet. It was just a surviving one. The sky stayed a dull orange most mornings, and the trees were thick and dark and packed so close together that even at midday the forest floors stayed shadowed and cold. The human colony sat in a wide, flat clearing, surrounded by those trees on 3 sides and a shallow gray river on the 4th. The colonists had been living there for 2 full years, and most of them had stopped flinching at every new noise the planet made. Most of them, but not all. Warrant Officer Dara Solon was one of the ones who still listened. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with such complete stillness that people often thought she was taller than she actually was. She had short brown hair, a wide jaw, and eyes that stayed slightly narrowed at all times, not from suspicion exactly, but from the deep and practiced habit of watching everything around her, without appearing to watch anything. She wore the standard gray field jacket of the Colonial Protection Force and kept a sidearm holstered at her hip like every other officer on Ferrat's Edge. But she also carried a composite recurve bow across her back and a quiver of bolts at her right side, and nobody on the colony had ever quite gathered the nerve to ask her why she preferred it. She liked early morning shifts. She liked the way the colony felt before the rest of the population woke up. Slower, smaller, more honest about what it actually was, which was a few hundred humans living on the edge of a forest that did not belong to them. She was on her 3rd perimeter walk of the week, moving along the eastern side of the colony fence in the gray pre-dawn light, when she found the water reclamation station. Or more accurately, she found where it used to be. The station was still present in the technical sense that all of its components were still there in the same location, but none of those components were connected to each other anymore. Every single panel had been removed with clean and careful precision. Every pipe had been detached at its joints. Every wire had been coiled into a neat loop and set gently on the ground beside the housing. The entire station had been taken apart the way a careful and curious mind takes apart a complicated toy. Every piece separated, every piece undamaged, every piece arranged in a clear and logical order on the muddy ground, as if waiting to be put back together by whoever came to look. Dara stood at the edge of it and studied it for a long time without touching anything. Then she studied the ground. The soil was soft from the previous night's rain, and it held impressions well. The tracks were clear, wide at the toe, deep at the heel, with a faint claw mark at the front of each print. She knew exactly what made that kind of track. She had studied the Keth long enough to read their movements by the marks they left behind. But these prints were small, far smaller than any adult Keth foot. These prints were roughly the size of a large dog's paw, rounded and light, pressed into the soft earth at irregular angles that suggested not a patrol, not a scouting approach, but the wandering and doubling back movement of something exploring. These were the tracks of cubs. Dara stood up slowly and turned in a full, calm circle. She kept her hands loose at her sides and her shoulders low, and her whole body as unthreatening as she could make it. She did not reach for the sidearm on her hip. She did not reach for the bow on her back. She simply turned and looked at the tree line with calm, open eyes. She found them on her second slow sweep. 3 pairs of amber eyes, wide and round and completely frozen, stared back at her from between 2 dark trees roughly 20 meters away. She could see the shapes behind those eyes clearly enough. Broad, feline faces with spotted pale fur, small rounded ears pressed completely flat against their skulls, and 3 sets of forepaws gripping the bark of the nearest tree with white-knuckled tension. They were young enough that their spots were still sharp and bright, young enough that their paws looked slightly too big for the rest of them. Dara crouched down slowly until she was closer to their eye level. She waited. The cubs did not run. They stared at her with their enormous golden eyes, and she looked back at them with her steady, narrowed ones. And nobody moved for close to 2 full minutes. Then the largest cub, the one positioned between the other two, tilted its broad head sharply to one side, in the way young Keth did when they encountered something that did not fit their existing understanding of the world. Dara tilted her head to the same angle. The largest cub made a sound, a short, soft, chirping noise, nothing like the deep, rolling vocalizations of an adult Keth. The 2 smaller cubs turned to look at it, like they were not entirely sure what it had just done. Then all 3 of them swung their eyes back to Dara. She stayed crouched. She kept her palms open and visible, and her face as neutral as she could hold it. She did not smile. She had read enough xenoanthropology material to understand that showing teeth was not universally friendly, and she simply remained still and present, and let them decide, at their own pace, what kind of thing she was. After another long moment, she stood up, unhurried, and walked back toward the colony. Governor Aldrin Marsh was not a calm man on his best days, and this was not one of his best days. He stood at the head of the briefing table, with both hands pressed flat on the surface, and his face flushed a deep and unhealthy red, and told Dara, in a voice that was working very hard to stay controlled, that the destruction of colony infrastructure by a known hostile species was a clear and obvious act of aggression, and that a full security lockdown was the only responsible answer. It was not an act of aggression, Dara said. They destroyed colony property. They took it apart, she said, and her voice was the same temperature it always was, which was roughly the temperature of cool river water. Every piece is still there. Every piece is clean and undamaged. They took it apart to look at what was inside it. Marsh stared at her. That is somehow more concerning. It means they are studying our infrastructure. It means 3 children got curious about a machine they had never seen before, Dara said. The word children sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Marsh opened his mouth and then closed it again. 2 security officers standing at the back wall looked at each other and then looked at the floor. Dara did not push the point. She had learned a long time ago that the right word at the right moment did not need pushing. So she let it sit there and do its own quiet work. She filed the incident report that afternoon, brief, factual, using the terms unauthorized deconstruction and juvenile contact event, and recommending observation over escalation in firm and simple language. She sent it, returned to her duties, and tried not to think too hard about how fast things could shift. They shifted faster than she hoped. The Eastern Sensor Grid fired a contact alert at 0600 the following morning. Large signatures, multiple contacts, moving in from the deep forest at a pace that was not the fast, explosive rush of a hunt, and not the slow wandering of an animal seeking water. It was the slow, measured, deliberate walk of warriors who had a specific destination and had already decided what they were going to do when they arrived. Dara was dressed and moving before the second alert came through. She jogged toward the eastern wall, and as she ran, she thought about 3 cubs with wide, guilty eyes and the careful, almost reverent way they had laid out every single component of that station in perfect rows on the muddy ground. She thought about a mother who had woken up and noticed her children were gone. When she reached the eastern wall and looked out over the flat open ground between the colony fence and the dark tree line, the warband was already standing there. 12 adult Keth warriors, painted in deep ceremonial colors, standing in total silence in the early morning light, with a stillness that was more threatening than any amount of noise could have been. At the front of the formation stood a figure larger and older than the rest, with heavy scars crossing both shoulders, and a warbow on her back that was longer than Dara was tall. Her golden eyes moved across the colony wall with the slow, cold patience of something that had stopped being surprised by anything a very long time ago. Dara looked at the warband and took one long breath. "All right," she said quietly, to nobody in particular. "Let's not do anything stupid today." The eastern wall of the colony was not built to be impressive. It was built to be functional, which meant it was 2 meters of reinforced composite paneling bolted to a steel frame, with a narrow walkway running along the top. It did its job well enough when the threat was wildlife or weather. Standing on that walkway now, and looking out at 12 Keth warriors painted in deep red and gray ceremonial colors, and standing in perfect silence in the early morning light, Dara thought the wall felt considerably less reassuring than usual. Governor Marsh arrived at the walkway 2 minutes after she did, still pulling his jacket on, his face doing the thing it always did when a situation exceeded his planning, a kind of rapid tightening around the eyes that made him look like a man trying very hard to read a sign in a language he had never studied. He looked at the warband, he looked at Dara, and then he looked at the 2 automated defense turrets mounted at the corners of the eastern wall. "Activate the turrets," he said. "No," Dara said. Marsh turned toward her with an expression that had moved past surprise and arrived directly at outrage. "I am the colonial governor of this settlement, and I am giving you a direct—" "If you activate those turrets," Dara said, in the same flat, river-cool voice she always used, "you will tell 12 Keth warriors that you are afraid of them. And Keth warriors do not negotiate with things that are afraid of them. They remove them." She kept her eyes on the warband the entire time she spoke. "Put the turrets on standby. Leave the targeting offline. Those are my recommendations, and I am putting them in writing the moment this is over." Marsh stared at her for a long and very uncomfortable moment. Then he turned to the security officer standing behind him and said, in a voice that sounded like a man swallowing something he did not enjoy, "Stand by only. Keep them offline." Dara was already moving toward the gate. "Where are you going?" Marsh called after her. "Out," she said. She heard him make a noise that was not quite a word behind her, but she was already at the gate controls, and she was already thinking through the next 30 seconds, with the cold, clean focus that always settled over her when a situation required her to do something that most people would consider extremely unwise. She was not fearless. She had learned years ago that fearless people made bad decisions because they skipped steps. She was afraid, in the precise and useful way that she was always afraid in moments like this, and that fear was telling her exactly what her body needed to do, and in what order. The gate opened, and she walked through it. She had left her sidearm on the walkway table before she came down, a deliberate choice, visible, something any watching eye could read. She wore her field jacket and her standard-issue boots, and she had her composite recurve bow slung across her back in its usual place, not drawn, not in her hands, just present the way it was always present, a part of her the way a person's arm is a part of them. She walked out into the open ground between the colony gate and the tree line, and she did not hurry, and she did not slow down. She moved at the same pace she always moved, which was the pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be, and was going there deliberately. She stopped about 15 meters from the front of the Keth formation. The elder mother was even larger up close than she had appeared from the wall. She stood at the head of her warriors, with her scarred shoulders square, and her golden eyes fixed on Dara with an expression that communicated nothing at all, which among the Keth was far more dangerous than an expression that communicated rage. Her warbow was on her back, a massive thing, dark wood carved with deep ceremonial markings, generations old by the look of it. Her right hand was resting at her side, and her left hand was open, and her whole body was the body of something that had made a decision and was waiting on one final piece of information before it acted on that decision. Dara stood still and open, and let herself be looked at. Then she heard the sound behind her, the quick soft padding of small paws on hard ground, and the 3 cubs came scrambling out of the colony gate behind her at a speed that suggested they had been watching from just inside, and had been arguing with each other about this exact moment for the last several minutes. Serac, the largest, arrived first and skidded to a stop at Dara's left heel. Tulla and Miv arrived half a second later, bumping into each other, and stopped at her right. They were breathing hard. Miv had a smear of something orange on her left ear that had definitely not been there the day before, and that Dara chose not to think about. Vraka, because that was the name the Xenolinguist files gave to the elder mother of this pride, though Dara had only read it in a report and never spoken it aloud, saw her cubs. Something moved across those cold golden eyes. Not softness exactly, nothing that slow and quiet, but a shift, a rapid and complicated recalculation, the look of a mind that has just received information that changes the shape of a situation entirely. Her gaze moved from the cubs to Dara and back to the cubs, and then it settled on Dara again, and this time it carried something new in it, a question. Her hand moved. It was instinct, pure and old and faster than thought. The right hand sweeping back toward the great warbow on her back, in the same motion that Dara's own hand had performed 10,000 times in practice. The warriors on either side of her shifted weight. The air between the two groups went tight and dense, the way air does in the second before something irreversible happens. And then Serac lunged forward and grabbed his mother's wrist with both small forepaws and yelled, in fast, high, urgent Keth, something that Dara caught only 2 words of, but understood entirely from the body attached to those words. The warband went completely silent. Vraka looked down at her eldest cub with an expression that Dara would later describe in her incident report as complex, because she could not think of a better word for the look of a mother who has been physically stopped by her child, and does not yet know whether to be proud or furious. Dara moved in that moment of stillness. She reached up slowly, keeping both hands visible, keeping every movement broad and deliberate and readable, and she unslung her bow from her back. She held it out horizontally, in both open hands, parallel to the ground, the way a xenoanthropology brief she had skimmed 3 years ago had described as the Keth posture of restrained capability, the physical statement that said, "I have this, I am trained in this, I am choosing to hold it still." She held that position, and she breathed, and she waited. Vraka stared at her for a very long time. The warriors on either side of her did not move. Serac still had both paws around his mother's wrist, and was looking between the two of them with enormous worried amber eyes. Tulla and Miv had pressed themselves against the back of Dara's legs, and she could feel their small warm weight there, which was either an enormous gesture of trust or a very practical decision to stand near the tallest thing available, and honestly, she respected both interpretations equally. Then Miv, the smallest, the youngest, the one with the orange smear on her ear, toddled forward on unsteady paws, and pushed her broad, flat nose against the back of Dara's right hand, and inhaled deeply. The sound that moved through the Keth warband then was something none of the colonists watching from the wall had ever heard before. It started low, and moved through each warrior in a slow ripple, not loud, not aggressive, carrying none of the edge of a battle sound. It sounded in the way that very large and very dangerous things occasionally sound, when reality declines to cooperate with their expectations, almost involuntarily and completely against their will, like something very close to wonder. Dara did not smile. She kept her face still and her hands level, and she let the moment be exactly what it was. Behind her, from the top of the colony wall, she could hear Marsh say to the security officer next to him, in a voice that had gone very small and very uncertain, What just happened?" The security officer, to his credit, thought about it carefully before answering. "I think," he said slowly. "She just passed some kind of test, sir." 3 days passed between the standoff at the Eastern Gate and the first formal meeting between the colony and the Keth Pride. 3 days in which nothing was decided and nothing was agreed, and yet something was clearly shifting, in the way that weather shifts before a storm. Not violent yet, but unmistakably in motion. The Keth warband did not leave. They moved back into the tree line, and they stayed there, visible in pieces, a flash of painted shoulder between the dark trunks, the faint amber glow of watching eyes at dusk, close enough to make every colonist on the eastern wall deeply uncomfortable, and far enough away to make shooting at them obviously unreasonable. Dara spent those 3 days doing 2 things. The first thing was talking to the cubs. Vraka had not forbidden it, which in Keth terms was not the same as permission, but was close enough to function as one for practical purposes. And the 3 of them had taken to following Dara around the colony perimeter during her morning walks, with the patient and utterly unembarrassed dedication of young things that have decided a particular adult is interesting, and have no intention of pretending otherwise. Serac walked closest and watched everything she did with serious golden eyes, and occasionally made a low questioning sound when she did something he did not understand. Tulla walked on the opposite side, and spent most of the time watching the colony buildings with the focused intensity of an engineer taking notes. Miv walked directly behind Dara's left boot, and tripped over it every 40 meters or so, without apparent frustration or change of strategy. The second thing Dara was doing was reading every xenoanthropology file she had access to on the colonial network, which was not many, and every tactical and cultural brief filed by the colonial authority contact teams, which were thorough but deeply unhelpful in the specific and immediate way that official documents always manage to be unhelpful when a real situation was in front of you. Or at least, it was Vraka who made the first gesture, which was the placement of a single flat gray stone at the midpoint between the colony fence and the tree line at dawn on the 4th morning. The colonial xenolinguist, a nervous young man named Pell, who had been living on a diet of stimulant tea and anxiety since the warband appeared, identified it after 40 minutes of database searching as a Keth territorial marker, used specifically to indicate a requested neutral point. Not surrender, not aggression, the specific meaning of which translated most closely as, "Here, if you are willing." Dara had temporary shelter frames up at that location within the hour. Marsh wanted to send a formal delegation, 3 senior officers, full-dress uniforms, the colonial authority diplomatic protocols printed out in a folder. Dara told him that was a bad idea, in the gentle but immovable way she had of telling people things they did not want to hear. She told him the Keth did not respond to formal displays as signs of respect. They responded to them as signs of insecurity, as the behavior of a group that needed external decoration to establish its own importance. She told him she would go alone with Pell as a translator and keep it simple. Marsh told her that was an unacceptable risk. Dara told him she would put that in writing too. She and Pell walked out to the shelter frames at midday. Vraka came out of the tree line alone, which made Pell make a small involuntary sound of relief before catching himself. The elder mother moved across the open ground with the slow, unhurried grace of something that had never once in its life needed to rush toward anything because everything had always eventually come to it. She sat across from Dara on the flat ground, and she looked at her with those cold, evaluating golden eyes, and she said nothing. Dara said nothing either. Pell looked between the 2 of them with the expression of a man who had prepared extensively for a conversation, and was now watching that preparation become irrelevant in real time. The silence lasted a long time. Then Vraka spoke, a low, rolling sequence of sounds that Pell translated in a quick, nervous whisper as a formal identification of herself. elder mother of the Verath Ridge Pride, fourth generation on this territory, holder of 11 treaties with other Keth prides, and 0 treaties with anything that was not Keth. Dara gave her own name, her rank, and her role. She did not mention the colony's size, or its weapons, or its colonial authority backing. She mentioned the river, the clearing, the 2 years of shared ground between them, and the fact that her water reclamation station was currently in pieces, but every piece was still present and undamaged. Something moved at the edge of Vraka's expression when Pell translated that last part. Then the cubs arrived. They came out of the tree line at a speed that suggested they had been waiting just inside the tree cover for what they considered an appropriate amount of time, before deciding that appropriate time had passed. They skidded to a stop a few meters back when Vraka turned her head toward them, and then Serac straightened himself up with visible effort, walked forward with great dignity, and sat down next to his mother, in the manner of a cub who intends to be taken seriously. Vraka let him stay. What happened next was not planned by anyone, and would not appear in Pell's official translation notes, because he was too busy scrambling to keep up with it. The cubs started talking. All 3 of them, overlapping and correcting each other with the enthusiastic chaos of young things who have been holding in a very important story for 3 days and can no longer contain it. And they told Vraka everything they had seen. They had been watching the colony for months. Dara specifically, they had noticed her early because she was the one who moved along the perimeter fence in the dark hours before the rest of the colony woke up, and among the Keth, any creature that voluntarily keeps the pre-dawn watch is worth observing. They had watched her sit down in the grass next to an injured earthbird and wrap its broken wing with careful hands. They had watched her step between 2 colonists who were screaming at each other with weapons in their hands, and stand there, unarmed and completely calm, until both men put their weapons down because her stillness made their noise feel embarrassing. They had watched her run toward a brush fire at the colony's south edge. Run toward it, not away, to pull a child out of the burning supply shed. And they told her about the bow. Serac described it with particular intensity. The way Dara came to the colony wall alone in the evenings, and practiced drawing and releasing into the empty air, with no target, no prey, nothing to aim at, just the motion itself, performed over and over, with total concentration. He described the sound of it, the clean snap of the release, the brief whistle of the bolt through the empty air, and the way she always stood the same way, breathed the same way, followed through the same way every single time, as if she was not practicing a skill, but performing something that had become as natural and necessary to her as breathing. Pell translated all of this in a voice that kept catching slightly on the words. Dara listened to the translation of what the cubs had been observing, and she felt something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite pride, and sat somewhere in between, as a general feeling of being seen more clearly than she had expected. Vraka listened to every word her cubs said, without interrupting them once. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time. She looked across at Dara with an expression that had changed since the beginning of the meeting. The cold evaluation was still there, but there was something else beneath it now. Something that had not been there before. Something that Pell was going to spend the entire walk back to the colony trying to find the right word for, and eventually settling on the word considering. Vraka pulled Serac aside with one large paw and spoke to him in a very quiet voice. Pell could only catch fragments of it from where he was sitting. He caught the word for warrior, and the word for elder, and the word for choosing, which in Keth had a specific weight that did not translate cleanly into human language. It did not just mean making a decision. It meant making a decision that costs you something, and doing it anyway. Serac listened to his mother with his ears up and his eyes steady. Then she asked him something, a direct, specific question, and he thought about it with a seriousness that was striking in something so young. When he answered, Pell caught every word clearly. "She is both, elder mother," Serac said. but she picks the quiet one first. Vraka was still for a long moment after that. Then she looked across at Dara, at the bow on her back, at her open hands resting relaxed on her knees, at the steady, unbothered way she was sitting in the dirt, on an alien planet, across from one of the most dangerous predators on this side of the colonial border. And the elder mother of the Verath Ridge Pride said 4 words in trade common that nobody present knew she spoke. "Show me your bow." It was not because anything bad had happened. The meeting had ended without incident. Both sides had walked back to their respective positions without a single weapon being raised, and Pell had filed a translation summary that Marsh read 4 times, with the expression of a man trying to decide whether good news delivered in a confusing way counted as good news. It was not violence keeping people awake. It was the particular and restless energy of a situation that has shifted significantly, and has not yet decided where it intends to land. Dara slept fine. She always slept fine when things were in motion, because moving situations were honest. They showed you exactly what they were, and asked you to respond to what was actually in front of you, which she found considerably easier than responding to what people were afraid might eventually be in front of them. She was up before the colony, as usual, dressed and moving through the pre-dawn quiet with her bow on her back and her boots quiet on the hard ground. She was on her second perimeter loop when she saw Vraka. The elder mother was standing at the edge of the neutral clearing, the same flat ground where the meeting shelters had been set up the day before, alone, without her warband, without her cubs, standing in the early dark, with her warbow on her back and her arms loose at her sides. She was facing the colony. She was watching the perimeter walkway with those gold eyes, and she saw Dara the moment Dara saw her, and neither of them moved for a long, still moment. Then Vraka stepped forward into the clearing and stopped at its center. Dara understood what that meant. She had read enough, watched enough, and spent enough hours in the company of Keth cubs to understand the grammar of what Vraka was doing, even without a word being spoken. Among the Keth, walking alone into open ground and stopping at the center of it was not aggression, and it was not surrender. It was an invitation of a very specific kind. It meant, I am here where you can reach me. I am asking you to be somewhere I can reach you. We are going to be equally exposed and equally capable, and we are going to see what happens next from that position. It was the deepest gesture of direct trust the Keth had. Dara walked through the gate and crossed the open ground and stopped 3 meters from Vraka in the center of the clearing and waited. Vraka reached back over her shoulder and unstrung her great warbow in one slow practiced motion and held it out in both hands. The same gesture Dara had used at the gate 3 days ago. Horizontal, open-handed, the restrained capability display, but reverse now, coming from the other direction, carrying a different weight. Dara looked at the bow up close for the first time. It was enormous and dark, and the wood had the deep burnished color of something very old. Not old in the sense of worn out, but old in the sense of used and cared for over a very long time by people who understood its value. The ceremonial carvings ran from grip to tip, and they were not decorative. They were names, Dara realized, reading the patterns the way you read a thing when you don't know its language, but can feel the intention behind it. Generations of names, carved in by hands that had held this same bow before Vraka, and before whoever taught Vraka, and before that. Dara unslung her own bow and held it out the same way. Vraka looked at it. She reached out one careful claw and ran it along the composite curve of the limb, not touching, just tracing the shape of it in the air above the surface. She made a low sound, not a word, just a sound of noting, and then she stepped back and turned to face the far side of the clearing. She drew her bow. Dara had watched Keth move in combat recordings, and in the movement files, the Colonial Authority kept on known pride territories, and none of it had prepared her for watching Vraka draw at close range and in real time. The motion was enormous and effortless and ancient-looking, like watching a piece of weather happen. The massive bow bending back to its full draw, with a weight that would have pulled most humans off their feet. Held there without trembling, the release coming at the end of a breath that was so controlled, it was barely visible. The bolt crossed the clearing and hit a tree at the far edge, with a crack that echoed off the colony wall. Then Vraka looked at Dara. Dara knocked a bolt and drew. Her bow was a fraction of the draw weight of Vraka's warbow, and the bolt it fired was lighter and faster, and it crossed the clearing in a flat line, and hit the same tree 6 centimeters above Vraka's bolt, and stuck there, quivering. Vraka made the same low-noting sound. They shot for an hour, not at each other, and not in competition, side by side, taking turns, sometimes at the same target, and sometimes at different ones, sometimes fast, and sometimes slow. Dara noticed early that Vraka watched her draw as much as she watched where the bolt landed, and Dara did the same in return. And what she saw in Vraka's technique was something she had not expected to find in something so physically different from herself. The same grammar, the same stillness at full draw, the same quality of breath, the same follow-through after release, where the hand stayed up and the eyes stayed on the target, as if the bolt was still being guided, even after it had left the string. Different bodies, different bows, different worlds, and completely identical intention. The warband watched from the tree line. The colonists watched from the wall. Nobody on either side made a noise. When the light had grown enough to make the targets on the far trees clearly visible, Vraka lowered her bow and turned to face Dara directly, and spoke in trade common, careful and deliberate, each word placed with the attention of someone who had learned a language in private and was using it in public for the first time. "Your young ones," Vraka said, "they will keep taking things apart." Dara considered this for exactly 1 moment. "Your young ones will keep watching," she said. "Might as well make it official." Vraka looked at her with a long, steady, evaluating expression. "The station," she said. "My cubs will fix it." "They don't have to," Dara said. "They took it apart," Vraka said. "Keth, law. They fix what they break." Dara thought about that. It was clean logic, and she had no objection to clean logic. "Fair," she said. Vraka held that for a moment and then said, "You knew I spoke your language." "I suspected," Dara said. "The way you listened when Pell was translating was too fast. You were already ahead of his words." Something crossed Vraka's face that took Dara a moment to identify, because she had not seen it there before. It was not warmth exactly. Warmth was too soft a word for anything Vraka did, but it was something adjacent to respect that had just moved 1 step closer to something else. "You say nothing," Vraka said. "Why?" "Because it was yours to share when you were ready," Dara said, "not mine to take because I noticed it." The clearing was quiet. Somewhere in the tree line one of the cubs made a sound, a short chirp, quickly hushed by one of the others. The morning light was coming up gold and flat across the open ground, and it caught the carvings on Vraka's warbow, and made the names there glow for a moment, like something lit from inside. Vraka looked at Dara for a long moment, with those unreadable gold eyes, and then she said one more thing in trade common, quiet and deliberate, like a word that had been decided on over a long time, and was finally being spoken. "Tomorrow," she said, "bring the cubs, both sets." Then she turned and walked back toward the tree line, and the warband closed around her in silence, and the forest took them all in, and the clearing was empty and still. Dara stood alone in the middle of it, with her bow in her hand, and the morning coming up around her, and she thought, both sets, and for the first time since the water station incident, She felt the shape of what was actually being built here, and it was considerably larger than a water station, and considerably more important than a treaty, and considerably harder to explain to Governor Marsh than anything she had written in a report so far. She walked back to the colony gate, and she was already thinking about what she was going to say. She decided she would start with, "The Cubs are going to fix the station," and work outward from there.